Ready? While this is sort of getting pulled up, I'm wondering by a show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves educators? And how many of you consider yourselves entrepreneurs? I'm curious what the rest of you consider yourselves. So George mentioned earlier that we had the honor yesterday of listening to some of our colleagues from India sort of frame what's going on in this country for us. And I found it hugely enlightening. And what I'm going to do is share with you some of the things I'm working on, but try and convince you that you all are better positioned to do these things than we are. And I think it's somewhat ironic that you have a bunch of these white guys who are flying in from sort of Canada, United States, to tell you about these things when I actually think you're better positioned to do some of these things than we are. We spent, my colleague John Puckett is an historian, and we went to the Gandhi Memorial yesterday, and there was this quote that said, "The rest of the world expects both goodness and greatness from India." And I think that's right, and I think your time is now. And so I'm hoping I can convince you. So I'm not going to talk about pedagogy. In some ways, I'm not going to talk about technology. I'm going to try and make an argument that I think you should build an ecosystem. Okay, so with that, let's start with a test, right? I'm an academic. I'm going to start with a test. So I'm going to show you a series of images, and then I want you all to tell me what they have in common. The first is, this is James Bond, for those of you who don't remember Sean Connery in the 60s. He was a British spy, or played a British spy. This is from a movie about a guy named Jaime Escalante, but this is sort of a very smart student in the inner city in Los Angeles who wanted to learn calculus. This is from another movie, Animal House. It's about a college student who was in his 6th year of college. This is from another movie. This is Gordon Gekko, a Wall Street trader. This is in the fields in Mexico. This is a child learning how to walk. This is an African miner. And these are firefighters after 9/11. So who wants to answer the question? What do they all have in common? I'm sorry? That is a correct answer, but not the one that I was looking for. Thank you. So I guess what I'm sort of going to try and convince you all, so I'm trained as an economist, right? So I think about learning as a production function. And I would say that all these folks face wicked learning problems, but with different constraints on them. So the firefighters after 9/11, it turned out that everybody who knew how to put out a fire in a tall office building died. And they didn't have a formal curriculum. They taught experientially. So overnight, the sort of expertise of the New York City Fire Department was gone. And they actually sort of trained firefighters from all over the world. The African miner, I worked on a project with an African miner. They had 100 different languages spoken in the mines, and everybody was illiterate. So how do you teach mine safety? The child learning how to walk, if we could just tell the kid how to walk, it would be so much easier, but of course they don't have the cognitive capacity yet to sort of understand this, or the physical coordination. You know, the child here would benefit immensely of sort of going to formal schooling, but sort of the uncertainty of that and the fact that they have to work to support their family, I'm sure this is sort of true in large parts of India as well, makes it impossible for them to access education. If good old Gordon Gekko had just had some ethics training, maybe we wouldn't see the sort of state of Wall Street today. You know, in this, there was a case of prejudice. So in this school, they basically thought the Hispanic kids couldn't do AP calculus. And in fact, in the story of this, when the kids, most of the kids got 5s in this class on their AP test, the testing company sent in to investigate because they assumed it was fraud. And if you are an undercover spy, you can't very well step out for professional development, right? So the point is that learning is everywhere. It's not sort of just in schools or higher education. It's everywhere, and it's huge. The second thing I'm going to try and convince you of, and I think you all probably know this, is certainly economic literature. Learning is basically just about the best good that you have. So research shows that when you have good educational systems, you have much more engaged citizenry. There's a bunch of studies that relate learning to human capital. So if you know more, you make more. There's a bunch of studies that show that people who are educated end up sort of, they quit smoking earlier. They tend to, I'm sort of not a good example of it, but they're supposed to be thinner and in better shape. So there's all these sort of relationships with health. In the United States, at least, it turns out that sort of the real estate community is always very, very interested in the school system because it hugely impacts housing prices. We all know that companies that invest in their people tend to outperform others. And there's even been a bunch of studies that show that learning and happiness, so ignorance is not bliss. Knowledge is bliss. And I think there's an argument to be made for global competitiveness, though I'm sort of kind of done with Finland. I don't know about you all, but everybody sort of keeps talking about sort of the TIM scores in Finland, and I'm like, who cares? All they have are trees. So they're going to have a bunch of educated people and trees. I'm not sure how they're going to compete. I think India could compete. So anyway, education's a perfect good. And there's a lot of good places where you can go. Even sort of our sister school up there, Harvard, just as an aside, Harvard's the oldest college in the United States. The University of Pennsylvania is the oldest university because we had a teaching hospital, and so we're able to go na boo-boo to Harvard because we're the first university in the United States. Of course, India had universities literally a millennium before anybody in the United States did. But anyway, for large parts of the world, and when Madan sort of gave his presentation, we know this, this is sort of a poem by Langston Hughes, which is, what happens to a dream deferred? Well, it sort of shrivels like a raisin in the sun. So for most people, they can't get all those things that I was talking about because they can't access learning. And we know that the world is not so much like this, but it's much more like this now. It's much more agile and limbo, and things are changing all the time. Is a good way to move up that value chain. And in this, India seems to sort of have some comparative advantages. So this is from my friend Charles Fidel, who is he's now working with OECD, but these are starting, so average median salaries of, I think it's PhDs in engineering. And you can get sort of a better talented person in India, as talented person in India for what? Is that a third of the cost, roughly, of somebody in the United States? But then again, this is sort of other OECD data that I sort of found. Everybody keeps comparing India to China. Look where China is on the TIMSS test, on the PISA test. And though India isn't participating overall in the country, but the two test sites where they did it 72nd and 73rd in the world, right? So right now I would say if you buy the learning thing, China's eating your lunch. So then we sort of talk about technology, and this is a conference, I guess, that in some ways is about technology. So this is from Archimedes, but everybody's convinced that all we need to do to solve all these problems is find the right tool, right? And then we can make free learning available to everyone, and the world would be wonderful. I'm less bullish on this, so I'm going to come back to this later, but this is a silver bullet, which we often use as sort of a one-shot solution for a problem. And over here, that is my sort of rendition of a drunken gambler, and I'll get back to the problem with drunken gamblers. So what we largely see, this is a music group called the Talking Heads, and they had this song that at one point they would say, same as it ever was, same as it ever was. So what we seem to see, at least in the United States, again and again, is there's all this rhetoric and all this hoopla, but nothing really changes all that much. So my question to you all is, are we really sort of tackling the right problem? And I'm not convinced that certainly in the United States we have been. So what is technology? So I'm an economist, and this is the Cobb's-Douglas function here. And if you look up there, the exponential, the alpha, that's technology. It's something simply that sort of with the combination of resources allows you to move your production frontier. You can do more with the same amount of resources when you have technological innovation. So I think if you start thinking about things in that sort of way, it may hopefully, at least for me, it's been changing the way I think about things. So we keep sort of talking again, Moore's law, everybody's enamored of it. Everything's going up, it's exponential. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We don't know what to do. And so here there's a picture. You had the scribe, then you had the printing press, and now with the internet age, we're all connected with information overload. So I'm going to give you an example now. Amazon, right? Anybody here shop on Amazon? Is Amazon available in Okay, so these are sort of a bunch of brushes that you can sort of buy on Amazon, and you can sort of see, which brush you might want. Now this is from Sears and Roebuck catalog, 1905. They're the same business, right? So you sort of had a catalog that you went through, you ordered, and then the mail delivery system delivered it to you. It's the same thing that Amazon is doing today. So I mean, I'm not convinced that Amazon is such a sort of spectacular innovation. The innovations from the business model are over 100 years old. This is a picture from about 1915. This is what a computer used to be, a woman, and they would these big companies would have rows and rows of women who would simply compute things. So if you went and looked in sort of Webster's dictionary, you would find basically somebody, or same with calculators, somebody who computes. I don't think that's what we're talking about. And Clark, I sort of found the same sort of slide. My wife's an anthropologist, so I was talking to her about how should I be thinking about tools and technology. And anthropologists argue that we have evolved with tools. So basically, we can't survive now as human beings without technology. Language being sort of the uber technology, right? Language was invented. It's a technology. And we literally couldn't survive without these things. And we also know that technology is cultural, right? So these are two different solutions for sort of getting food into your mouth. And we also know that technology evolved. So this is somebody who figured out that they could use a chopstick to put their hair up. So who would have thought, this is Thomas Edison, so when he invented the phonograph, he was doing it, he was convinced he was going to make $1 gazillion on business with this sort of thing called the phonograph. And that's John Eastman, who sort of invented celluloid film. And you put those two things together, and you get Bollywood. So I guess one of the things that I sort of think about is everybody's convinced that there's this panacea, that they have a theory of change. If we just do this or that, we're in good shape. But I would argue if you go back and you look at the history of technological innovations, it's really hard. You can sort of in hindsight go back and sort of say, well, we know how Bollywood got here today. We can sort of backtrack it. But I don't think Thomas Edison was sitting there going like, okay, right? When I build this phonograph, if I combine it, then there'll be this sort of huge, multi-billion-dollar industry where there will sort of be these, I guess, romantic comedies with song that will sort of be watched throughout all of Asia. And so I get a little bit worried when people think that they can predict exactly how technologies are going to impact learning. And there's all these sort of things. So for a while it was Cisco, and have any of you seen these things? These are sort of virtual conferences. Everybody's like, that's going to change education. Or Steve Jobs, the iPad's going to change education. Or Blackboard. At Penn, we're killing Blackboard and moving to something else. But so anyway, I think there's all these different tools out there, and it's unclear. I mean, I'm actually bullish on the tools, but I don't think that there's anything that we figured out that is the end-all, be-all solution for these things. So I went to Oxford English Dictionary. I guess as a person from the United States, I should have gone to Webster's Dictionary, but I tend to prefer OED. And the top part was a definition of IT. So the branch of technology concerned with the dissemination, processing, and storage of information. And this was learn. And this was to acquire knowledge as a result of study, experience, or teaching. I actually think these two things are sort of more closely linked than we tend to think about. So one of my questions to you is, this is data. Is that a technology? So here, this is sort of a survey of students and how they like to learn. So in groups, doing practical things with friends. Is that a learning technology, sort of knowing that? Is pedagogy itself a technology? How about curriculum? This is sort of a study that John and I did with a doctoral student, tracing the history of curriculum from the Greeks to the present day. And what ends up happening is you can see where things are dropped and dotted line, it becomes optional. So this has evolved. Is curriculum a technology? Is technology the issue? Well, we know that it's disruptive, right? At least, though I guess sort of, if we buy George's argument, we should be thinking about transformative. But let me go back to this reform thing. So in the United States, at least, you have either the federal government or these big foundations. I like to pick on the Gates Foundation. They have theories of change. And so the Gates Foundation says, we think that if we just improve teachers, say, then all of American education will be sort of better. And then they place a $200 million bet. Or we think that small schools are the answer. And there, I can't remember how much they spent, 100, 150 million, and the research showed that sort of basically no impact. I think they behave like drunken gamblers. A drunken gambler is convinced that if they just put this next dollar down, they will win, and they will win really big. And I think instead what we need is more of a market-based approach. I was talking to Jeffrey Moss from ETS. He's an investor guy. He would never behave like a drunken gambler. He would sort of look for almost diversity of ideas. He would want to see that they were sort of reasoned and reasonable and had done as much due diligence as possible. But I'm sort of putting my thought, you wouldn't put all of sort of ETS's resources on sort of one sort of innovation, would you? Right? How many, can you share how many investments do you have going on right now? 10. So he's placing 10 different bets. But there seems to be this interest, in at least in the United States, in education reform of finding one thing. You know, it's going to be a tablet. I thought what Clark says is exactly right. It's one of many things that might sort of impact things. So what I had been thinking is what we need is, instead of a panacea, a silver bullet, a one solution for everything, what we need is a lot of ideas and a lot of solutions and more ideas and a way of sort of organizing all this stuff. So, you know, this sort of seems to be a popular word today, but sort of an innovation ecosystem. So this has come up a couple times, Silicon Valley. I actually think what we need to build is a Silicon Valley for education. I actually think it should happen here, right? So, and what do I mean by that? There's sort of a bunch of things that sort of allows Silicon Valley to sort of emerge as an ecosystem to fostering the development of information technologies, right? So it had Stanford, which is a pretty good school. You had sort of investment capital, you had a regulatory environment, you had a lot of smart people sort of near each other. And for some reason, though, at least in the United States, when we talk about reform, we don't think about the business end of it, sort of the investment end of it, the regulatory environment. It's sort of always, if we can come up with a pedagogical tool, largely leveraging a information technology, that's sort of the solution. Now, this is a quote. Cardinal Newman was an Irish cleric who sort of wrote pretty eloquently about a university. So I work at a university, I like to think, so that's basically my job description. Of course, it's not, right? But it certainly sounds sort of noble. But the problem with universities is there's a great sort of, Levitt was at Sloan at MIT, and in the 70s he wrote this article about buggy whips. And the story of the buggy whip is that there was this competition for making better and better buggy whips. And they kept sort of improving on the technology of buggy whips, not recognizing that automobiles had arrived and that everybody else was sort of, you know, buying automobiles. And of course, the person who made the best buggy whips was the last person standing, but was utterly irrelevant. And I sort of worry sometimes that this is what we're doing at universities in the United States. We're sort of solving the wrong problem. So for example, those of you might not know it, but the computer was invented at the University of Pennsylvania. So this was the first computer, the ENIAC. It was invented in sort of during World War II. And the point is that this was incubated at a university. Now what ends up happening, these are sort of two students who the first thing they did is when they came up with an idea, they left university. They took the money and ran. And so my question is, what happened to universities? How did we become so irrelevant in a way for this sort of innovation and incubation? And so my hypothesis, you can't read this, but it says, I'll be happy to give you innovative thinking. What are the guidelines? This is unpublished, but it's really great. I got permission to use this from MIT. So this is a study done at MIT among MIT alums as where they got the skills that helped them do their job. Now, can we all agree that MIT is a pretty good university? Right? Mechanical engineering, the core of MIT, right? This isn't sort of like the media lab. I mean, this is sort of what MIT was built to do. So I don't know if you can see this, but blue is where learned at MIT. Sort of the red is graduate school. The yellow is learned on the job. And the sort of light blue or aqua is learned anywhere else. So, and over here is what they learned at MIT. And over here is what they use. I find that interesting. I'm not sort of solely, because it's self-reported, right? And they may not realize that a lot of what they learned at MIT provided sort of grounding and foundational things to be able to do these other things. But it's still worth a conversation. But most universities in the United States have their heads in the sand. And I'm at an ed school. And in the United States, the ed school is almost, in general, at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of sort of stature within a university. Right? So arts and sciences, the philosophy department, the mathematics department, and then medicine, and Wharton's our business school. I hope you guys have heard of that. It's considered a pretty good school. And then sort of down in sort of pecking order, somewhere between social work and continuing education is the School of Education. Even though we have all this rhetoric about being in a knowledge economy and a creative economy, and I hopefully have convinced you that learning is ubiquitous, but ed schools get a bum rap. And quite frankly, I think deservedly so. And I think part of the sort of reason is we've forgotten our roots. So Ben Franklin founded us. And when he founded the University of Pennsylvania, he wanted it to be practical. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that we were supposed to be of use to the world, right? So now we spend a lot of time thinking about where we're publishing and which journals and who's reading those journals. We don't care if any of you are reading the journals, right? It sort of matters if our colleagues at other prestigious universities are reading the journals. I don't think that's what he had in mind. I think he had in mind a lot more of what you all are talking about here. That said, I think there's a role for universities to play. So these are all the founders of the social sciences, right? So Adam Smith is sort of my intellectual origins. Herodotus is John Puckett's, and he's an historian, right? So the father of history. And so I think there is sort of a role for us in terms of the R&D component, maybe thinking about and hopefully providing technical assistance to folks like you all. Because I think that multiple lenses ends up answering questions in interesting ways. So we heard on Sunday night, about gurus, and the fact that, I gather guru means teacher. Is this correct? And rabbi in Hebrew, anybody know what that means? Teacher, right? So I think you can think of Buddha as a teacher, Confucius as a teacher, Muhammad as a teacher, Jesus Christ as a teacher. There's a long, sort of rich history here. But somehow we've sort of forgotten about it a little bit. And again, I'm struck there's a long, rich history in India, right? So I believe this is correct, but Nalanda, I think, is the second oldest university after there was a university in Egypt that is a little bit older. And I was a little bit sort of concerned when I heard about the current situation of the regulatory environment where the Indian government is. But if you compare sort of India's sort of structure as a government, say, if you compare it to China or sort of Saudi Arabia or even the United States, there's some hope of actually sort of more sort of coordination. I mean, China could be sort of perceived as maybe a little bit too highly regulated and structured and sort of, I don't want to say, well, I'll say oppressive. The United States might be a little bit too unstructured, and the United States in some ways is the worst of all possible worlds in that there's a lot of regulations, but there's no governance. So I think what you guys need to do, and what we ought to be trying to do in the United States as well, is create a sandbox, a place for everybody to come together and play with these different ideas, recognizing that there's beauty in the diversity of ideas rather than getting obsessed about coming up with one idea and scaling it. So in my mind, scale may not be the right answer. It's sort of scale versus the long tail. So the sort of founder of Wired magazine wrote this sort of really interesting book about the long tail. And the idea is that there's sort of diversity of solutions, that everybody might need something slightly different, as opposed to this goal of finding one solution, and all we need to do is, the numbers to us in the United States are very intimidating here. So I think it was George who said 500 million, he couldn't even wrap his, so I guess you'll have to think about scale in some way because there's 1.2 billion people here. But I don't think you're going to come up with one solution, and I don't think you should. So with that, I will stop. How was I on time? Are we okay? Okay. Any sort of reactions? Anybody want to argue with me, or I'm totally fine with it? So the question is around moral education?
How effective it is to build an ethical base for the development of the human resources?
It's not an easy question, you realize that, right? So I'll start off by saying I'm the schmuck. Has anybody heard of WorldCom? Right, so I'm the guy who did all WorldCom's ethics training after they got into trouble. Wanted to sort of make sure you understood it was after they got into trouble. And what was interesting there is when they originally, so what ended up happening is they got into trouble, a few people went to jail, they lost a lot of money, a lot of people lost their life savings, a lot of people lost their jobs, and the SEC, which is sort of the governing organization of the Security and Exchange Commissions, and the New York Bankruptcy Court said, if you don't institute some ethics training, we're shutting you down. So they sort of asked people to sort of bid, and I sort of said, well, what the heck, I'll sort of see if I can do this. 86,000 people, 10 different languages, and we had 6 weeks to design it and 3 weeks to deliver it. But the point was, is all the bankruptcy court and the SEC wanted was to check the box. Right? So they wanted to be able to say, we have delivered the sort of ethics training. And if you look, this is sort of a little bit of a generalization, if you look at most ethics training, it's housed in the Office of Legal Counsel of the organization, which means it's a compliance issue. It's not a learning issue, right? And so I think, again, I'm not sort of trained as a philosopher, but I think that one could make a case that if one could demonstrate the outcomes of bad behaviors, particularly in gray things, it's pretty clear when everybody knows there's sort of a couple of things you shouldn't do unless sort of extreme circumstances, like killing people is not a particularly good thing to do. There might be some moral justification in certain instances, but I think most people would say killing people as a general rule is bad. The problem is that life generally doesn't sort of end up being that black and white. And I'm not fluent in the research in this area, but there seems to be some evidence that a lot of the ethics training, if you go beyond the check the box issue, the people know what they're not supposed to do, but they still do it. Right? So I think it's sort of an interest. So I would argue that the work in this area is premature. That I don't think that folks have been able to develop, unless it's sort of a highly structured culture within the organization, which is what they would call an endowment effect. It's sort of hard to argue that it just sort of happened. I think it would be, I just don't think there's a huge amount of evidence that says, wow, Harvard's ethics training program, yeah, they just got it right. And all you have to do is, any organization, you send them to their 3-day seminar to the leaders there, and that company forever will be an effective institution. And there, of course, now with the sort of whole global context, it's a little bit tricky because some of ethics, one might argue, is sacrosanct and universal, but there's a lot of ethics that seem to vary across cultures. So it's sort of a roundabout way of saying, I guess, no. Any other questions? All right.
From the point of view of, Doug, from the point of view of creating the sandbox, what do various stakeholders, in your opinion, need to be doing to make that sandbox possible?
So I think one of the problems I see, at least, so in the United States, in this sector, there's two phenomena. So you have what I call the lemming phenomenon, which is sort of everybody chasing Gates. So whatever Gates does, I mean, literally the Obama administration saying, well, if Gates sort of thinks that it's about community colleges, we should put all of our money in community colleges too, because they have so much money that we can then leverage our dollars. And then the other foundations are doing that as well. So you have this sort of lemming phenomenon. And then the other one is a prisoner's dilemma. So for those of you who know games theory, you have a bunch of people being sort of reasonable agents or actors in their own space who end up tripping over each other. So what we've been trying to organize is you need to have the research community, the entrepreneurial community, the sort of consumers, if you will, whether they're schools or colleges or companies, the regulators, the philanthropists, and the venture capitalists, all sort of with enlightened self-interest. So you can't sort of go to a researcher and say, we're going to ignore the fact that you need to publish in peer-reviewed articles, and we're going to ignore the fact, all these sort of things, because it's not the right thing to do. You should be doing this, because they won't play that. So you have to sort of build the system in such a way where everybody sees like, oh, that's a game where what I know how to do is really useful to helping sort of people win the game. And what I heard from you all on Sunday night is because there's sort of one hand, there's a rich tradition and value of learning, but in some ways the structure is somewhat loose and there's not as much baggage. So one of the things we talked about is for-profit education. In the United States, this is seen by some as a pejorative term. It's a bad thing. You shouldn't be making money off of poor kids or tax dollars. And my sense is here, there's just not the same sort of issue perceived with it. If it's good and it works, great. I think there was one statistic where private schools in India are only 10% of the schools, but like 40% of the kids go there, right? That's sort of a really interesting sort of, I mean, you all seem to be culturally just more sort of pragmatic in a way.